In this presentation, I'm going to talk about coercive diplomacy, and this should follow on the discussion of coercion basics. And one might ask, what's the difference between coercion and coercive diplomacy? To be honest, I'm not sure. Sometimes I think when people talk about coercive diplomacy, they don't know that they're talking about coercion, or they're muddying the water. However, and I would say that coercive diplomacy could be about the use of coercion, and you could make a distinction that, look, coercion can be part of what you do, but it can also be part of a broader strategy of persuasion, trying to convince somebody that what they're doing is wrong. That's a big part of diplomacy, right? Another part could be, hey, we could have positive incentives here. So there could be a mix of, coercion's a tool, and coercive diplomacy could be using a mix of tools. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know that the authors I have here do a much better job of creating the distinction that I just said we need. But let's take a look at what we got. Alexander George is a major author. One of the seminal works on this is Forceful Persuasion, Coercive Diplomacy as an Alternative to War. So already we're seeing this idea that there's some distinction between coercive diplomacy and war. Again, we could say, hey, that distinction is that we're, like Schelling said, that if we look at war as being brute force, we're something that directly achieves the desired outcome through force, as opposed to coercion, which requires the acquiescence of the target, and you're trying to get compliance with the demand. That could be part of it, right? That coercive diplomacy is a different type of strategic interaction. But Alexander George does not give us quite this clarity. Nevertheless, he argues it's forceful persuasion, an attempt to get a target to change its behavior through the threat of force or the use of limited force. So forceful persuasion, again, not to talk about angels dancing on the head of a pin or anything, but what do we mean by these things? Persuasion means changing someone's mind, right? So when I engage in persuasion, I am convincing you of something you didn't believe before, right? I'm persuading you to do something. However, using threats is not changing your mind, it's changing your calculations, cost-benefit calculations. And so we have a lot of places that people will talk about strategy, how am I going to get someone to do something different? I'm going to change their cost-benefit calculations. And certainly threats can do that, right? Because threats say, hey, if I make a credible threat, well, now your cost-benefit calculation has to take the threat into account. So we have this idea, threat of force and the use of limited force. So a lot of the discussion of coercive diplomacy is this, the distinction authors will make is that it's not full war, or it's not full coercion, right? I've had that complaint leveled at me when I was talking about this and using a coercion model. Oh, coercive diplomacy is not coercion. I'm like, really? How do you figure that? And so a lot of times it's that mean. And one problem I have with that is the most successful threats are ones that are never employed, right? And so, like I say, with coercion works when you never have to deploy the threat, and therefore you never get to the war, right? So this is something, or the sanctioning, or whatever the threat is, right? So I know I'm throwing a lot of shade on this already, but this is that point of view, and this is George's forceful persuasion argument. In his book, and kind of cutting to the chase on this, he sees that there's 8 things that are necessary, and most of these things kind of line up with what we talked about with coercion. But let's go into them because, like I say, George's work is seminal work, and we should cover it. Clarity of objective. We need to know what we're trying to achieve. That's again, very similar in coercion, you need to have a specific demand. There needs to be a strong motivation on the part of the coercer. The coercer has to be willing to accept costs. Probably going to, that in coercion relates to credibility and resolve, right? The willingness to go in. You have to have domestic and international support for coercion, for coercive diplomacy, right? You can't be isolated, or it helps to have it. You need to have strong leadership by the coercer, right? And that can be, we can interpret that as kind of from a personal point of view. We can also look at that as political unity within the coercer's country and with factions in the coercer's government. Clarity of precise terms of settlement. This, to my mind, smacks of type 2 credibility. The willing, what are the precise terms of settlement? That is, you've issued a threat. So what are the terms that will keep you from deploying the threat, right? So I think of that as being a type 2 credibility thing. Sense of urgency in the target, fear of escalation by the target, right? If this goes to the target's sensitivity, first, a sense of urgency, time's a wasting. And urgency implies that things are going to get worse if we don't make an agreement. So that implies a scenario of escalating costs from a coercion point of view. But George just says sense of urgency in the target. Fear of escalation by the target. This is a big thing. Are you willing to cross the next threshold? Are you worried that I will cross that next threshold? And usually the logic there goes to, am I going to do better at, first of all, escalation always implies, whether or not somebody models it explicitly, it implies a threshold, right? That there's some difference between what we're doing now and what we're doing next time. And that when you go through that, right, when you go through that threshold, are you able to operate? Are you able to interact at the same level as the other guy, right? Are you able to, or are you able to do better, right? So if we kick this up a notch, which side is able to better defend itself, to suffer costs? Who will, if we go up a level, will there be asymmetric costs imposed, et cetera, et cetera? So fear of escalation on the part of the target is an important thing. I don't know why a lack of fear on the part of I don't know why we're only looking at the target's sense of urgency and the target, but again, that's George's thing. He focused on these 8 principles. And finally, asymmetry of motivation in favor of the coercer. This idea that the coercer, now, the difficulty I have here is to say I'm more motivated than you is an interpersonal comparison, and it's very problematic. What I like to do is say, hey, what's my motivation, right? Versus my motivation to win versus my sensitivity to the costs, right? And the potential costs. And if that inequality, if you balance that scale, right? And it's kind of the idea is each actor has a scale. The coercer and the target has a scale. And on one side is their desire to win. On the other side is the cost they have to bear to win. And if the costs outweigh the benefit, then presumably they'll give in. And so both have a scale. And so we don't have a scale between the two people. We have 2 scales, and we say, what's the difference in the balance between the two? And that's, I think, a better way of thinking about it. Now, another work I want to talk about is Art and Cronin's The United States in Coercive Diplomacy. They looked at many cases of coercive diplomacy, and they kind of have it's a book of case studies. Their overarching propositions or conclusions are they notice that positive incentives correlate with success. And here they say, look, when you threaten someone with, carrot and stick, basically, and that's absolutely what this is, right? The stick is the threat, and carrots, they're kind of arguing carrots, cases in which there were very definite positive incentives offered, it wasn't all a threat, seemed to work better. They also argued that positive inducements, these carrots again, appear to work best when they're offered at the same time or after threats or demonstration of force. So you start with a stick, brandish the stick at least, and then offer the carrot. That's their argument. No idea, theoretically why that would be the case. This is empirical, right? They also say that when there is an attempt at denial, right, meaning that you're really trying to limit somebody's capabilities rather than compel them to do something, right? When what you're seeking with your diplomacy is simply to, to limit somebody's scope of action, and you're not trying to go whole hog, right? That seems to work better, right? So the concept of denial comes in here, where you're issuing threats or taking actions that you're trying to limit a person's capability, limit an actor's capabilities in the international system, as opposed to getting them to overtly change a policy or accept a demand. That seems to also work better. Otherwise, they found little correlation with the type of demand that's made. So that's, that's their overall propositions. They come up with the following policy guidelines, right? And so in looking at their cases, and, because they've written a book and they've had their heads buried in it, and coercive diplomacy is difficult and unlikely to succeed. This is the first thing you get. And I got to tell you, this is a very common thing. When anyone looks at coercion is always taken to be difficult and unlikely to succeed. And the thing that I always bring up in that is, yes, but that might be due to selection bias, that we are only looking at cases where the coercion, where threats are actually made and employed. And, there are a lot of other cases where that don't, the cases where coercive diplomacy will be most successful will be the ones that are the least obvious, where the least explicit threats were used, where there haven't been demonstrations of force, that haven't gotten to the point of very visible negotiations. That's my asterisk I put on this. Similarly, likely outcome is difficult to predict. This is another factor of the cases that would be predictable are the ones that don't occur, right? If it's likely, if it's a no-brainer that if I threaten you, you're going to do what I do. Well, yeah, we're not going to get very far down the road. If it's a no-brainer that I can threaten you all you want, and you aren't going to change your position, well, duh, I'm not going to threaten you. I'm going to leave it alone and try, I'm not going to want to be embarrassed, right, by failing. So again, the cases that we see are likely to be the borderline ones where it's not obvious what the outcome would be. So again, I have to put another asterisk here. However, this is this is the thing that comes up when people look at this again and again in different contexts. Coercion is difficult. It's unpredictable. Military superiority does not guarantee success. This is something that goes back through all of this. It's about resolve, right? And so, yes, military capability gives you a lot of cool threats. It doesn't give you credibility, type 1 or type 2. It doesn't go to the question of, hey, are you able to hurt somebody or threaten to hurt somebody more than what you're asking them, do something worse to them than what you're asking them to give up. Positive inducements enhance prospects of threat, but only after threats of force, which is, again, interesting. Positive inducements, when you issue a threat, the threat doesn't get employed if it's effective, right? When you offer a bribe, the bribe will occur, right? If the bribe is successful, it will be paid. So positive inducements are, one, I think they make a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense that offering the carrot in addition to the stick works, right? That's common sense we've had in our head in human existence, right? That's why we have the expression carrot and stick. But also, from the selection bias point of view, I think we're going to see that as well. So I'm really beating up on that. I'm sorry. Demonstrative denial works better than punishment or risk, right? So saying that you're going to do something that is going to limit someone's capabilities is better than threatening to hurt them or going, with a risk strategy, right? And the risk strategies are the things I talked about, hanging someone out the window, in coercion. I talked about that sometimes if you have a credibility problem, oh, we don't think you'll actually attack us. Well, maybe I won't attack you, but I'll put my forces in, I might not do that, but I'm going to put my forces in proximity to yours, and the chances of an accident or us mixing it up with unintentionally will increase, right? So I'm going to take riskier and riskier actions, and, that threatens a greater probability, right, of something happening. That's a credibility issue. And so the argument is that doing things and threatening to do things that'll limit a person, a actor's capacity, are perhaps more effective. Finally, they argue, don't resort to coercive diplomacy if you're not prepared to go to war or to fail, right? And these are your options, right? And it doesn't work a lot. And so you have to understand that on the other side of this, you may have a high level of conflict or you may fail, right? And again, at the very end, they bring up the whole selection bias thing. You should not do this unless you're really willing. And so the question of the resort to it and when it's used is very important. So those are the policy guidelines. That's a little bit about coercive diplomacy. I've kind of poo-pooed the idea along the way, but it's an important one. It gets brought out, and I think my issue is always we should be clear about what we're using. Are we using coercion? Are we using a more cooperative approach? But coercive diplomacy can very much be the combination of these things. And when we're looking at the history of it, as Art and Cronin do, we have to keep in mind the selection bias issue when trying to draw conclusions from the past. So those are the key points. Thank you for joining me.